The rain in Chicago that Tuesday felt less like weather and more like a final judgment. It battered the black umbrellas of the 300 attendees gathered around the sprawling cemetery plot, drummed against the imported Brazilian mahogany of the casket, and soaked through the hem of Vivian Hayes's black wool coat. She was 68 years old, and for the first time in 40 years, she was entirely, utterly alone. Her husband, Richard Hayes, the ruthless, brilliant architect of Hayes Property, a real estate empire that had swallowed half the city's commercial skyline, was dead, a massive coronary at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and unsigned contracts. He died exactly as he had lived, working, calculating, and prioritizing his empire over everything else. Vivian stood at the front of the grave, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. She didn't cry. The tears had refused to come since the moment the hospital called. Instead, there was just a hollow, echoing cavern in her chest. She looked to her left, seeking the comfort of the family she had poured her entire youth, her dreams, and her very soul into building. Harrison, her eldest, was 42. He stood a few feet away, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, holding an umbrella over his own head while his mother's coat grew heavy with rain. He wasn't looking at the casket. His thumb was flying across the screen of his phone, answering emails, his jaw clenched in that familiar, arrogant way Richard used to have. Next to him was Claire, 38. She was wearing a black silk dress that cost more than most people made in a month, her eyes hidden behind oversized Chanel sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She wasn't mourning. She was performing. Vivian watched her daughter discreetly check her Rolex, a sigh of impatience barely escaping her perfectly painted lips. And then there was Marcus, 32, the baby of the family, the boy Vivian had rocked to sleep through countless fevers and night terrors. He was staring at the ground, nervously shifting his weight, entirely dependent, as always, on the mood of his older siblings. When he caught his mother looking at him, he quickly averted his gaze. Not one of them reached out to hold her hand. Not one of them offered a shoulder. After 40 years of making them her entire world, Vivian realized, with a chilling clarity, that she was not a mother to them. She was just an employee whose shift had finally ended. 2 days later, the real nightmare began. The boardroom of Hayes Property was a fortress of glass, steel, and cold intimidation located on the 45th floor of a downtown skyscraper. Vivian sat at the far end of the long oak table, feeling out of place in her simple gray suit. The room smelled of expensive cologne, leather, and greed. Mr. Sterling, the lead corporate attorney for the firm, sat at the head of the table. He was a shark in a pinstripe suit, a man who had helped Richard crush competitors for decades. Harrison sat immediately to Sterling's right, practically vibrating with anticipation. Claire and Marcus flanked him. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Sterling said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He adjusted his glasses and opened the thick, leather-bound folder. The last will and testament of Richard Hayes. Vivian folded her hands in her lap. She didn't care about the money. She just wanted the security of her home, the sprawling estate in Lake Forest she had personally decorated, the gardens she had tended when Richard was too busy on business trips. She wanted peace. "To my eldest son, Harrison Hayes," Sterling read, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I leave 40% of all voting shares in Hayes Property and the title of Chief Executive Officer." Harrison leaned back, a smug, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't even look at his mother. "To my daughter, Claire Hayes, I leave 30% of the shares, the summer house in the Hamptons, and a cash disbursement of $5 million. Claire let out a breath she seemed to have been holding, a look of pure relief washing over her features. She immediately pulled out her phone, undoubtedly texting her interior designer. "To my youngest son, Marcus Hayes, I leave 20% of the shares and the vintage car collection." Marcus nodded quickly, a weak, compliant gesture. Vivian waited. 90% of the $50 million empire was gone. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating. "Mister?" Sterling turned a page, cleared his throat, and finally looked down at Vivian. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flash of pity in his cold eyes. "And to my wife of 40 years, Vivian Hayes," Sterling continued, the words falling like stones into a still pond. "I leave my personal biometric encrypted USB drive, currently held in my private office safe. Furthermore, Vivian has granted a period of exactly 7 days to vacate the Lake Forest estate, which will transfer immediately to the ownership of the Hayes Family Trust, managed by Harrison Hayes. The words hung in the air. Vivian couldn't breathe. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in on her. 7 days? Her home? The house she had raised her babies in, the home she had maintained while Richard worked 18-hour days? "Wait," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken. "There must be a mistake. Richard wouldn't. The house is mine. I designed it. I poured my life into it." A sharp, mocking laugh echoed through the room. It was Harrison. "Don't be dramatic, Mother," Harrison said, closing his notebook with a sharp snap. "Dad was a businessman. He knew exactly what he was doing. You haven't worked a day in 40 years. You wouldn't know how to manage the property taxes on that estate, let alone the upkeep. I gave up my interior design firm to raise you." Vivian's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and rising panic. "When your father and I started, we had nothing. I signed over my business equity to secure his first commercial loan. I built this family." "You stayed home and threw dinner parties, Mother," Claire chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Let's not rewrite history. Dad built the empire. You just lived in it." Vivian looked at Marcus, her youngest, pleading with her eyes. "Say something. Defend me." But Marcus just stared intently at his own hands, too cowardly to cross his older brother and sister. "Mr. Sterling," Vivian said, trying to steady her trembling hands. "What about my bank accounts? The joint accounts? Per the prenuptial agreement you signed in 1986, which was updated a decade ago, all joint accounts fall under the corporate umbrella," Sterling replied, his tone clinical. "Harrison, as the new CEO, has already frozen them to audit the estate. You have no liquid assets, Mrs. Hayes. I suggest you use your 7 days to find suitable accommodations." Sterling reached into his briefcase and slid a heavy metallic object across the polished wood table. It stopped right in front of Vivian. It was a thick, military-grade USB drive with a small digital screen and a tiny 10-digit keypad built into its casing. "Your inheritance, Mrs. Hayes. Good day." The drive felt as heavy as lead in her palm. 40 years of her life. 40 years of biting her tongue. Of smoothing over Richard's explosive temper. Of attending parent-teacher conferences alone. Of pretending she didn't know about his late-night meetings in the city. 40 years of absolute loyalty, reduced to a piece of metal and an eviction notice. The cruelty of her children was swift and absolute. They didn't even wait the full 7 days. By day 3, Harrison had permanently deactivated her credit cards. When Vivian tried to buy groceries, the cashier at Whole Foods looked at her with pity as the card was declined 3 times. By day 5, Claire showed up at the Lake Forest mansion with a team of movers. Vivian stood in the grand foyer, watching as strange men in overalls carelessly tossed her personal belongings, photo albums, clothes, the porcelain dishes her grandmother had given her, into cheap black trash bags. "Claire, please," Vivian begged, watching her daughter direct the movers like a general. "That vase is fragile. Your father bought that for me in Paris." "It goes to the estate auction, Mother," Claire said briskly, sipping an iced coffee. "Harrison wants the house cleared by the weekend so the staging company can come in. We're putting it on the market. Nobody wants to buy a house that smells like an old woman." The insult felt like a physical blow. Vivian looked at the girl she had once braided hair for, the girl she had sat up with until dawn when she had her first heartbreak. She was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who only saw her mother as a liability. "Where am I supposed to go, Claire?" Vivian asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I have $200 in cash. I have nothing." Claire paused, finally looking at her mother, but there was no empathy in her eyes, only irritation. She reached into her Prada handbag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it onto the foyer table. "Take an Uber to a motel. Figure it out. You're an adult." With that, Claire turned her back and walked away. By the end of the week, Vivian Hayes, the former matriarch of Chicago's elite, was living in a damp one-room apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the South Side. The wallpaper was peeling, the radiator clanked violently in the night, and the smell of stale cigarettes and mildew hung heavy in the air. It was a profound, suffocating fall from grace. At 68, when her friends were taking cruises through the Mediterranean and spoiling their grandchildren, Vivian was sitting on a mattress she had found at a thrift store, wrapped in an old sweater, trying to figure out how to survive. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. 2 days later, Vivian walked into a local discount supermarket, a harsh fluorescent-lit warehouse miles away from the organic grocers she used to frequent. She bypassed the aisles and walked straight to the manager's office. She took a job on the night shift cleaning crew. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. Vivian had always kept herself in good shape, but pushing a heavy industrial mop across miles of sticky linoleum floors from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. was agony. Her joints screamed in protest. Her hands, once soft and manicured, became calloused and cracked from the harsh industrial chemicals. One night, while scrubbing a spilled jar of pickles in aisle 4, a sharp pain shot up her lower back, dropping her to her knees. She knelt there on the cold floor, her reflection staring back at her in the dirty puddle of vinegar. Her gray hair was frizzy, her eyes sunken with dark bags, her face lined with an exhaustion she had never known. A tear finally escaped, cutting a hot path down her cheek. "Is this it?" she thought. "Is this how my story ends? Scrubbing floors while the children I raised sleep on silk sheets bought with my sacrifice?" She forced herself to stand up. She gripped the handle of the mop so tightly her knuckles turned white. No, she refused to let them break her completely. Every morning after returning from the supermarket, Vivian would sit at the small, rickety Formica table in her apartment. She would place the metal USB drive in front of her. It was her obsession, her only connection to the life she had lost. The screen on the drive was simple. It only displayed a prompt for a 6-digit code, and below it, a terrifying warning glowing in red pixels. 3 attempts remaining. Fail equals wipe data. Richard was a paranoid man. He didn't trust the cloud, he didn't trust banks, and he certainly didn't trust his own children. Whatever was on this drive was highly classified. But what could it be? And why leave it to her? Vivian spent hours writing down combinations in a cheap notebook. Birthdays, anniversaries, social security numbers, the date he started the company, the date they bought their first house. On a rainy Tuesday, 2 weeks into her new life, desperation took over. She typed in their wedding anniversary, June 14th, 76. She held her breath and pressed the tiny enter button. The red light blinked. Error, 2 attempts remaining. Fail equals wipe data. Vivian gasped, pulling her hand back as if the drive had burned her. She couldn't guess again. Not yet. She couldn't risk losing the only thing Richard had left her, even if it was just a final, cruel joke. A sudden, sharp knock at her apartment door startled her. She quickly threw a kitchen towel over the USB drive and walked to the door. She unbolted the heavy chain and opened it a crack. Standing in the dingy hallway was Marcus. He looked out of place in his designer leather jacket, his eyes darting nervously down the shadowy corridor. "Mom?" he whispered. Vivian opened the door wider, her motherly instincts flaring up despite the betrayal. "Marcus? What are you doing here? Is it safe for you to be in this neighborhood?" Marcus slipped inside, looking around the miserable apartment. A look of genuine horror crossed his face. "My God, Mom! You live here? This is awful." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a brown paper grocery bag. He set it on the table. "I brought you some food. Real food. And here." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and pressed it into her cracked, calloused hands. "It's $1,000 in cash. It's all I could pull from the ATM without Harrison's accountants tracking it." Vivian looked down at the money, a lump forming in her throat. The cold, hard shell she had been building around her heart cracked just a little. "He came," she thought. "My baby boy came to check on me. He isn't completely lost." "Oh, Marcus," Vivian whispered, pulling him into a hug. He smelled like expensive cologne and stress. Thank you, sweetheart. I've been so scared." "I'm sorry, Mom," Marcus mumbled into her shoulder, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Harrison is out of control. He's acting like a dictator. He fired half the senior staff. Claire is just spending money like water. I didn't know how to stop them from kicking you out. I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Vivian lied, patting his back. "I'm surviving. Let me make you some tea. I only have chamomile, but it's warm." "Sure, thanks, Mom." Vivian turned her back, walking the 3 short steps to the tiny kitchenette. She turned on the rusted faucet, filling the kettle. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. Maybe she could salvage Marcus. Maybe she could save one of her children from the toxic rot of the Hayes wealth. As the water began to heat, Vivian reached up to get 2 mugs from the cabinet. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a movement reflected in the small, greasy window above the sink. She froze. In the reflection, she saw Marcus. He wasn't looking at her. He was standing by the Formica table. Slowly, quietly, he lifted the kitchen towel. He saw the heavy metal USB drive. His hand darted out. He grabbed the drive and shoved it deep into the inner pocket of his leather jacket. The silence in the room suddenly felt deafening. The kettle began to emit a low, whining whistle. Vivian slowly turned around. Marcus was standing exactly where she had left him, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets, trying to maintain a look of innocent concern. "Is the water boiling yet?" he asked, his voice trembling just a fraction. Vivian didn't answer. She looked at the table. The towel lay flat. The drive was gone. Something inside Vivian Hayes snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a silent, profound severing of the invisible cord that had tied her to this boy for 32 years. The unconditional love, the endless forgiveness, the blind devotion. It all evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, icy clarity. "Take it out, Marcus," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the warm, soothing tone of a mother. It was low, raspy, and dangerously calm. Marcus blinked, taking a step back. "Take what out, Mom?" "Do not insult my intelligence." Vivian stepped away from the stove, her posture straightening, her aching back forgotten. "The drive. Take it out of your jacket." Panic flashed in Marcus's eyes. His facade crumbled instantly. "Mom, listen to me. Harrison thinks Dad hid the company's offshore account passwords on that drive. He needs it. The board is breathing down his neck. And what did he promise you for being his little thief?" Vivian asked, taking a slow step toward him. "Did he promise to pay off your gambling debts in Vegas? Did he promise you a new Ferrari?" Marcus swallowed hard, his silence the only confirmation she needed. "You didn't come here to see if your mother was starving," Vivian said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You didn't care that I'm scrubbing floors at night. You came here to rob me. You used my love for you as a distraction." "Mom, please, it's just a stupid piece of metal. You don't even know the password. Harrison will give you $10,000 for it." He promised. Marcus pulled the drive from his pocket, holding it like a shield. "Just let me take it to him. You can get out of this dump." Vivian moved faster than she had in years. She closed the distance between them, grabbed Marcus by the wrist, and twisted it sharply. With her other hand, she snatched the heavy USB drive from his grip. "Hey, Mom, stop!" Marcus yelped, stumbling backward. Vivian marched to the door and threw it open, the hinges screaming in protest. She pointed out into the dark, damp hallway. "Get out!" "Mom, you're being unreasonable. Harrison is going to destroy you if you don't give it to him." "I said get out!" Vivian roared, a primal guttural sound that echoed down the hallway. It was the roar of a woman who had finally been pushed past her breaking point. Marcus stared at her, terrified. He had never seen his mother like this. The docile, accommodating woman was gone. In her place stood a woman with eyes as hard and cold as diamonds. He backed out of the door, his hands raised in surrender. "You're crazy," he muttered, turning and practically running down the hall. Vivian stood in the doorway and watched him go. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the urge to call him back. She stepped back inside and slammed the door, locking the deadbolt in the chain. She walked over to the table, picked up the envelope of cash he had left, and threw it into the trash can. She didn't need their poisoned money. Vivian sat back down at the table, placing the drive carefully in front of her. She stared at the screen. 2 attempts remaining. Fail equals wipe data. Her husband had been a monster. Her children were monsters. They had taken her kindness for weakness, her silence for stupidity. They thought they had buried her in this slum. "You want to play a game, Richard?" Vivian whispered to the empty room, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with a new dark fire. "Fine, let's play." The end of the week brought a bitter, biting cold that seemed to seep right through the thin, uninsulated walls of Vivian's apartment. It was the kind of cold that settled deep into the marrow of her bones, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. Her night shift at the supermarket had ended prematurely and with brutal finality. At 3 a.m., the shift manager, a man in his late 20s who smelled of cheap energy drinks, had called her into the back office. He didn't even have the decency to look her in the eye. "You're just not moving fast enough, Vivian," he had muttered, clicking a pen nervously. Corporate tracks the square footage cleaned per hour. Your numbers are in the red. We need someone with more stamina. I have to let you go." She hadn't argued. She had simply untied her stained apron, folded it neatly on his desk, and walked out into the freezing night. When she arrived back at her apartment building, her legs feeling like lead weights, she found a bright neon orange sticker slapped across the peeling paint of her front door. Notice of eviction. Pay in full by Friday 5 p.m. or premises will be secured. It was Thursday morning. She had exactly 36 hours before she was officially homeless. Vivian unlocked the door, the chain rattling in the quiet hallway, and stepped inside. The apartment was freezing. The radiator had finally given up entirely. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply walked to the small Formica table, sat down in the rickety chair, and stared at the heavy metal USB drive. She was out of money. She was out of time. She was out of options. Her fingers, swollen and aching from the industrial bleach, hovered over the tiny keypad. 2 attempts remaining. Fail equals wipe data. She had to try again. She couldn't let it sit there while she ended up sleeping on a park bench. She closed her eyes and thought of the children. They were her life's work, her greatest and now most painful achievement. Surely Richard had some lingering sentimental attachment to them. She carefully typed in a combination of the kids' birth months and years. She pressed enter. The screen blinked. Once, twice, error. 1 attempt remaining. Fail equals wipe data. Vivian let out a choked sob, her forehead dropping to rest against the cold Formica table. The red warning light blinked rhythmically, a mocking heartbeat in the dark room. 1 attempt. If she failed again, whatever Richard had left her, a message, a final insult, a tiny life insurance policy, would be gone forever, erased into digital nothingness. She sat up, wiping her eyes fiercely. "Stop crying," she commanded herself. Crying hasn't solved anything for 40 years. She needed to stop thinking like a heartbroken mother and a grieving widow. She needed to think like Richard Hayes. Who was Richard? He was a predator, a man who viewed every relationship, every interaction, as a transaction. He didn't value sentimentality. He hated birthdays. He thought anniversaries were an excuse for greeting card companies to extort people. He valued leverage. He valued capital. He valued sacrifices made for his ultimate gain. When had she been most valuable to him? Not when she gave birth to Harrison. He had been on a business trip in London and missed the delivery. Not when she maintained the perfect household. He considered that her baseline duty. Vivian closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back through the decades. Back past the mansions, the private jets, the charity galas. Back to a small, cramped apartment in 1980. Richard was desperate. He had found the perfect commercial property to start his real estate firm, a dilapidated warehouse district that he knew would be rezoned. But the banks wouldn't lend to him. He had no collateral. He was pacing the floor, furious, defeated. And then Vivian had stepped in. She had just launched Vivian Hayes Design, a boutique interior design firm. It was her passion, her independent identity, and she had just secured her first 3 major clients. She had a solid business plan and pristine credit. She remembered sitting across from the loan officer at Chase Bank. She remembered Richard's hand gripping hers, not in love, but in anxious anticipation. She remembered the scratch of the fountain pen as she signed the documents, leveraging her entire business, her intellectual property, and her future earnings to secure Richard's loan. She had sacrificed her own empire so he could build his. She had killed her dream to give birth to Hayes' property. The date. She remembered the date clearly because it was the day a part of her soul had quietly died. May 12th, 1980. Vivian opened her eyes. Her hands were no longer shaking. The cold in the room didn't bother her anymore. A strange, serene calm washed over her. She reached out and typed the numbers into the keypad. 051280. She pressed enter. The red light stopped blinking. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen went entirely black. Vivian held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then the screen glowed a brilliant, steady green. Access granted. Decrypting files. A small port popped open on the side of the drive, revealing a standard USB connector. Vivian scrambled to her feet, nearly knocking the chair over. She rushed to the corner of the room, pulled out the battered 5-year-old laptop she had managed to hide from Claire's movers, and plugged the drive in. A single window popped up on the screen. Inside was a solitary text file named for_Vivian.txt. She clicked it. The document opened. It wasn't a long letter. It wasn't an apology. It was exactly what Richard would write. Vivian, if you are reading this, it means you finally stopped looking at me through the lens of a wife and started looking at me for who I really am. It also means you remembered the exact moment you bought your share of this empire. I never forgot your sacrifice. I just never acknowledged it. By now, Harrison, Claire, and Marcus have shown you exactly who they are. I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. I gave them the spotlight. But I am giving you the power. Call Julian Vance. Use the secure line listed below. Tell him the architect has left the building. Do not let them win. Richard. Below the text was a phone number and a 12-digit alphanumeric code. Vivian stared at the screen, her mind racing. Julian Vance? The name sounded vaguely familiar. He wasn't part of the corporate legal team. He was an old, quiet man who occasionally attended their Christmas parties decades ago. A private attorney Richard played chess with but never did visible business with. She grabbed her cheap prepaid cell phone and dialed the number. It rang once. Vance? A deep, gravelly voice answered. Mr. Vance, Vivian said, her voice surprisingly steady. This is Vivian Hayes. The architect has left the building. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then, a long exhale. I've been waiting for your call, Mrs. Hayes, Julian Vance said, his tone softening with a profound respect she hadn't heard from a man in months. Where are you? I'll send a car immediately. 2 hours later, Vivian was sitting in a plush leather armchair inside a discreet, unmarked office building in the financial district. A hot cup of Earl Grey tea sat untouched in front of her. Julian Vance sat across from her. He was in his late 70s, with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and an aura of absolute discretion. On the mahogany desk between them sat a thick stack of legal documents. I am so incredibly sorry for what you have endured these past weeks, Vivian, Julian said quietly, clasping his hands together. Richard's instructions were absolute. He demanded that you experience the full reality of your children's character before I was allowed to intervene. He believed it was the only way to shatter your illusions. He wanted me broken, Vivian said, staring at the files. No, Julian corrected gently. He wanted you forged, like steel. He knew that if he simply handed you the money upon his death, your maternal instinct would take over. You would have paid Harrison's debts. You would have funded Claire's lifestyle, and you would have continued to enable Marcus. You would have given it all away to people who do not respect you. Julian leaned forward, tapping the thick stack of papers. 15 years ago, Richard realized that the children were unsalvageable. Harrison is greedy but lacks vision. Claire is a black hole of vanity, and Marcus is a coward. Richard knew that leaving them the main company was essentially handing them a sinking ship. He loaded Hayes' property with toxic debt, high-risk leverage, and poison pill contracts. Vivian's eyes widened. The $50 million empire is a mirage, Julian smiled, a thin, ruthless smile. It's a ticking time bomb. But while he was loading that ship with lead, he was quietly siphoning the real wealth, the clean, untraceable capital, offshore. Julian opened the folder and pushed the top document toward her. It was a certificate of incorporation from the Cayman Islands, heavily redacted, but one name was clearly visible: Vivian Hayes. Richard established a fully funded, irrevocable blind trust. Because it was set up in an offshore jurisdiction and structured through multiple shell LLCs, it bypasses U.S. probate courts entirely. Your children have no idea it exists. The IRS knows it only as a foreign entity paying standard corporate tax rates. How much? Vivian asked, her voice a mere whisper. Julian didn't blink. Liquid cash, blue-chip stocks, and prime international real estate. The current valuation sits at exactly $112 million. You are the sole uncontested beneficiary. You have absolute unilateral control over every single cent. The room seemed to spin. $112 million. The neon orange eviction notice on her peeling apartment door flashed in her mind. The aching in her knees from scrubbing the supermarket floor throbbed. I have already transferred $200,000 into a secure private checking account in your name for immediate use, Julian continued, sliding a sleek black titanium debit card across the desk. The rest is waiting for your orders. Vivian looked down at the black card. It wasn't just plastic and metal. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was her life, returned to her with interest. She picked up the card. The cold metal sent a shockwave of electricity up her arm. "Julian," Vivian said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the last trace of the victimized widow. "I need a hotel, something private. Then I need you to arrange for the purchase of a residential property, not in the suburbs, in the city, under a shell company name." Julian's eyes gleamed with approval. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes. Where to first?" "The Peninsula Hotel," Vivian said, standing up. She didn't look back at the chair. "And Julian?" "Yes, ma'am?" "Find out exactly how much debt Harrison is holding. I want to know every creditor he owes money to. It's time I started managing my investments." The transformation of Vivian Hayes did not happen overnight, but it happened with a terrifying velocity. She checked into the presidential suite at the Peninsula under a pseudonym. When she stepped into the massive marble bathroom, she stripped off the cheap worn clothes from the thrift store and dropped them into the trash can. She stood under the scalding hot rain shower for an hour, watching the dirt, the smell of industrial bleach, and the stench of poverty wash down the drain. She didn't cry. She didn't mourn the woman she had been. That woman was dead, buried under the cruelty of her own children. The woman who stepped out of the shower was entirely new. Over the next 3 weeks, Vivian worked exclusively from the shadows. She didn't reveal herself. She didn't call her children to gloat. With Julian's help, she purchased a sprawling 6,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. She didn't decorate it in the soft, floral, maternal styles of the Lake Forest mansion. She hired a top-tier architectural firm to outfit it in sleek, modern lines: black marble, dark walnut, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It looked like the command center of a villain, and she loved every inch of it. She hired a personal assistant, a sharp, fiercely loyal young woman named Sarah, who signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Next came the wardrobe. Vivian did not try to dress to look younger. She had zero interest in recapturing her youth. She wanted to look exactly like what she was, a highly dangerous, impossibly wealthy woman in her late 60s. She flew in tailors from Milan. Her closet filled with bespoke Armani suits in charcoal, navy, and blood red, cashmere coats, Tom Ford sunglasses. One Tuesday morning, exactly a month after she had been fired from the supermarket, Vivian stood in front of the full-length mirror in her penthouse dressing room. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit her impeccably, a crisp white silk blouse, and a single string of South Sea pearls. Her silver hair, once frizzy and neglected, was cut into a sharp, elegant bob. Her posture was ramrod straight. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. Sarah, her assistant, walked into the room holding an iPad. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Sarah said, respectfully keeping her distance. "Julian Vance sent over the briefing you requested on Hayes' property." Vivian turned away from the mirror. "Tell me." "It's exactly as Mr. Vance predicted," Sarah read from the screen. "Harrison Hayes missed his second consecutive payment on a $30 million mezzanine loan. The bank is threatening to call in the debt. Claire Hayes has maxed out her credit lines against her equity, and Marcus Hayes is currently dodging calls from 2 different bookies in Las Vegas. The corporate stock has plummeted 40% since your husband's passing." Vivian walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city of Chicago sprawling below her. It was raining again, just like the day of the funeral, but she wasn't the one getting wet anymore. "Harrison is desperate," Sarah continued. "Word on the street is that he's looking for a private equity savior, a ghost investor to buy up the toxic debt and inject cash. Otherwise, the firm files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the month." A slow, chilling smile spread across Vivian's face. Richard had set the trap perfectly. The children had eagerly walked right into it, blinded by their own greed. They thought they had inherited a kingdom, but they had inherited a slaughterhouse. "Call Julian," Vivian said without turning away from the window. "Tell him to set up a new holding company. I want to buy every single piece of Hayes Properties debt. Buy the mezzanine loan. Buy Claire's equity lines. Buy it all quietly." Sarah paused, her fingers hovering over the iPad. "Ma'am, if you buy their debt, you become their primary creditor. You'll hold the power to either save them or force them into complete liquidation." Vivian finally turned to look at her assistant. Her eyes were as cold as the glass behind her. "I know," Vivian said softly. "It's time my children learned the true cost of doing business." The atmosphere inside the Hayes property boardroom was toxic, thick with the stench of desperation and stale coffee. It was the exact same glass-walled room where barely 2 months ago, Vivian had been systematically stripped of her home, her dignity, and her past. Now the tables had turned in ways the 3 occupants of the room couldn't possibly comprehend. Harrison paced the length of the long oak table, his custom suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his hand, a chorus of angry creditors and panicking board members. He ignored them all. Claire sat slumped in one of the leather executive chairs, staring blankly at the polished wood. She wasn't wearing Chanel today. She wore a simple, unbranded black sweater, her face pale and devoid of makeup. The bank had seized her Hampton house 2 days ago. Her Maserati had been repossessed the morning prior. Marcus sat in the corner, chewing aggressively on his thumbnail, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. The bookies had finally found him, and his left eye was swollen shut from a friendly warning delivered in a parking garage the night before. "Where the hell is this guy?" Harrison snapped, glaring at his Rolex. "Vance said the investor would be here at exactly 2 o'clock. It's 2:15. Doesn't this phantom billionaire know we're bleeding out here?" "Harrison, please stop yelling," Claire whispered, rubbing her temples. "If this investor doesn't sign the restructuring agreement today, I'm personally bankrupt. Do you understand that? I'll have to fly commercial. I'll have to rent an apartment." She said the word rent as if it were a terminal disease. "We're all bankrupt, Claire," Harrison shouted, finally losing his temper. "Dad left us a hollowed-out pumpkin and called it a carriage. The whole company was leveraged to the hilt. This investor, Vanguard Holdings, bought up every single piece of our debt over the last 3 weeks. They own our loans. They own our mortgages. They own us. We just need to beg them for a 12-month grace period." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom suddenly clicked open. Harrison stopped pacing. Claire sat up straight. Marcus stopped chewing his nail. They all turned toward the entrance, putting on their best masks of corporate confidence, ready to grovel to whichever ruthless Wall Street titan had bought their lives. Julian Vance walked in first, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He looked calm, collected, and utterly professional. "Mr. Vance," Harrison stepped forward, extending a hand that was visibly trembling. "Where is the representative from Vanguard Holdings? We have the restructuring contracts ready to sign." "The sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings is right here, Harrison," Julian said smoothly, stepping aside. The sound of confident, rhythmic footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the hallway. And then she stepped through the door. Vivian Hayes did not look like the woman they had thrown out into the rain. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal Armani suit that radiated power. A single strand of flawless South Sea pearls rested against her collarbone. Her silver hair was sharp and modern, her posture impeccable. She carried a custom leather portfolio under one arm. But it wasn't the clothes that made her unrecognizable. It was her eyes. The soft, accommodating maternal warmth that had defined her for 40 years was gone. In its place was a look of absolute, terrifying authority. The silence in the boardroom was so profound it felt like a vacuum. Harrison's outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Claire gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Marcus scrambled backward in his chair, his good eye widening in sheer disbelief. Vivian walked slowly past her paralyzed children. She didn't look at them. She walked straight to the head of the table, the seat that had always belonged to Richard, the seat Harrison had so eagerly stolen. She pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down. She placed her portfolio on the desk, unclasped it, and folded her hands on top of it. "Close your mouth, Harrison," Vivian said. Her voice was calm, modulated, and cut through the room like a scalpel. "You're letting the air conditioning out." "Mom!" Harrison finally choked out the word, his brain violently rejecting the reality in front of him. "What? What are you doing here? Did you break in? Mr. Vance, what is the meaning of this?" "I assure you, Harrison, Mrs. Hayes is exactly where she is supposed to be," Julian said, taking a seat to Vivian's right. He opened his briefcase. "Mrs. Vivian Hayes is the sole beneficiary of the offshore trust that funds Vanguard Holdings. She is the investor who purchased your corporate debt. She is the investor who holds the mortgage on Claire's remaining properties. She is the investor who bought out Marcus's gambling markers." Claire let out a whimpering cry. No, that's impossible. Dad left you a USB drive. You were living in the slums." "I was." Vivian turned her piercing gaze to her daughter. And I scrubbed floors at a supermarket on the night shift while you hired a private chef for your dog. I ate stale bread while you complained about the color of the marble in your foyer. Mom, please, Marcus pleaded from the corner, his voice cracking. I brought you money. I tried to help you. Vivian's eyes snapped to her youngest son, pinning him to his chair. You came to my apartment to steal from a woman you thought was broken and defenseless, Marcus. Do not dare insult me by calling it charity. Harrison slammed his hands onto the table, his face flushed dark red with a mix of humiliation and fury. This is illegal! Dad couldn't do this. He couldn't hide $100 million from his own children and give it to a woman who doesn't know the first thing about business. Your father, Vivian said, leaning forward slightly, knew exactly what he was doing. He knew you were parasites. He knew that the moment he died, you would discard me like trash. He set a trap, Harrison, a $50 million trap lined with toxic debt and poison pills. And you, in your infinite arrogance, swallowed it whole. Vivian opened her portfolio. She pulled out the restructuring contracts Harrison had prepared. She looked at them for a long moment, the silence in the room stretching tight enough to snap. Mom! Claire stood up, her legs shaking. The reality of the situation had finally crushed her ego. She walked toward the head of the table, tears streaming down her face. Genuine tears for the first time in her adult life. Mom, please, we're your children. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how I treated you. Please, just sign the grace period. Don't take everything from us. I have nowhere to go. Vivian looked at her daughter. She remembered holding Claire when she was a baby, rocking her through the night. She remembered the fierce, protective love that had defined her entire existence. She searched her heart for that feeling now. It was gone, burned away by betrayal. When I stood in the foyer of the house I built, begging you for help, Vivian said softly, you threw a $100 bill at me and told me to figure it out. Vivian reached into her Armani jacket. She pulled out a crisp, new $100 bill. She placed it gently on top of the restructuring contracts. Figure it out, Claire. Claire let out a gut-wrenching sob and collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. You're a monster, Harrison hissed, backing away from the table. You're actually going to bankrupt your own blood. You're going to put us on the street. I am not doing anything to you, Harrison, Vivian replied, her tone icy. I am simply refusing to save you from the consequences of your own incompetence. I am calling in the debts. Today, Vanguard Holdings is foreclosing on Hayes' property. Harrison looked like he was going to vomit. Marcus was openly weeping. The empire was gone. However, Julian Vance spoke up, adjusting his glasses. Richard Hayes did leave one final addendum, a poison pill, if you will, regarding your personal bankruptcies. The three children looked up, a pathetic glimmer of hope in their eyes. Julian pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. In the event of total corporate liquidation, a secondary trust fund exists. It contains exactly $3 million, $1 million for each of you. Harrison let out a breathless laugh. Oh, thank God, thank God. Okay, $1 million is enough to start over. It's enough to get back in the game. There are stipulations, Julian interrupted, his voice raising just enough to silence the room. To access this money, you must each secure employment, not in management, not in finance. Manual labor or minimum wage service industry positions. Janitorial staff, fast food service, warehouse loading. What? Claire gasped, horrified. I can't work at a McDonald's. People know me. You must maintain this employment, clocking no less than 40 hours a week for a period of exactly 5 consecutive years, Julian continued, ignoring her. If you quit, if you are fired for cause, or if you attempt to use any outside financial assistance, you forfeit the $1 million permanently. The absolute horror on their faces was a masterpiece. Richard had truly outdone himself from beyond the grave. He wasn't just taking their money, he was forcing them to live the life they had so casually condemned their mother to. 5 years? Harrison yelled. Flipping burgers for 5 years? That's insane! I won't do it. We'll sue the estate. We'll drag this through court for a decade. You have no money to hire a lawyer, Harrison, Vivian reminded him gently. I have over $100 million. I will bury you in legal fees before you ever see a courtroom. Julian slid the contract across the table. The decision is yours. Sign the agreement to enter the 5-year labor program, or walk out of this room with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs. Harrison stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Claire was hyperventilating. Marcus just looked defeated, a man who had finally realized the ride was over. Vivian stood up. She didn't need to see them sign it. She didn't care if they signed it. Her part in this tragic play was finally over. She picked up her portfolio. She looked around the boardroom one last time. The glass walls, the expensive oak table, the terrified faces of the strangers she had once called her children. "I spent 40 years of my life making sure you three never had to struggle," Vivian said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "That was my greatest failure as a mother. I made you soft. I made you cruel. But today, I am finally setting you free." She turned and walked toward the doors. "Mom!" Harrison called out, panic finally breaking his pride. "Mom, where are you going? You can't just leave us like this." Vivian paused at the door, her hand resting on the cool metal handle. She didn't look back. "I have a business to run, Harrison. Some of us actually have to work for a living." She pushed the doors open and walked out into the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking confidently on the marble, leaving the poisoned empire behind her forever. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline looked the same, but the power dynamics had drastically shifted. The Hayes property logo had been quietly removed from the downtown skyscraper, replaced by the sleek insignia of Vanguard Holdings. But Vivian didn't spend her days in that cold boardroom. She let Julian and a team of sharks handle the liquidations and investments. She was busy elsewhere. On the sunlit second floor of a beautifully restored brick building in the Arts District, a new sign hung over the door. Vivian Hayes Design. Inside, the studio was bustling. 3 talented young architects were hunched over drafting tables, arguing passionately about light fixtures and spatial flow. Fabric swatches and paint samples covered the massive central island. The air smelled of fresh coffee, cedarwood, and creativity. Vivian stood at her drafting table by the window, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She was sketching the interior layout for a boutique hotel in Aspen. Her hands, once cracked and blistered from bleach, were healed, holding a graphite pencil with practiced grace. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Julian Vance. "Monthly audit complete. Vanguard is up 12% for the quarter. Also, the private investigator confirmed the subjects are still employed. Harrison was promoted to shift manager at the lumber yard. Claire is currently working the register at a high-end grocery store. Marcus is 3 months sober and working landscaping." Vivian read the text. She didn't smile, but a profound sense of peace settled over her chest. It was harsh medicine, but maybe, just maybe in 5 years, she would have a family worth speaking to again. Or maybe she wouldn't. For the first time in her life, she realized she was entirely fine with either outcome. She set the phone face down, picked up her cup of Earl Grey tea, and walked out onto the small wrought iron balcony. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. She took a sip of her tea, looking out over the city. She was 70 years old. She was wealthy beyond measure, completely independent, and doing exactly what she loved. The architect had indeed left the building, and she had built herself a magnificent new life.